and invite the leader of the Affirmative team to start their team's case.
Look, Taiwan is already in a very vulnerable position to China, which are a small little island on the coast of China where these people have moved over for democracy. When you allow China to give them aid, to give them money, they now become dependent on China, or China can place this over their heads. Firstly, on setup, and then secondly, on my first substantive, which is how this allows China to increase control of Taiwan. Secondly, on why this is in the best interest of the Taiwanese. And thirdly, how we get better aid. Firstly, and Jumana will extend on the harms in a global context. Firstly, on setup. Why does China have bad incentives? I think firstly, they believe that Taiwan is a part of China, don't believe in the Taiwan's independence. Secondly, they want control of the South China Sea because of the trade routes, and they want that 160 kilometers from the official coast, which they can extend from having Taiwan as part of their land. Thirdly, in general, they dislike democracy, and the Western states, which align with the values of Taiwan, are also allying with Taiwan. Therefore, even if you don't believe that China has bad incentives generally, they are harmful incentives to Taiwan itself. Okay, firstly, on how this allows China to increase control of Taiwan. What does the current position of Taiwan look like? Taiwan is completely opposed to the Chinese government because they consider themselves separate and a part of the West because they have more liberal views. Secondly, Taiwan is much weaker militarily and economically than China because A, they have less people, and B, they have smaller land mass, and C, they're in a highly fought area, so they have a lot of conflict that destructs their country in general. Firstly, I think this allows them to economically control Taiwan, right? The context of this is that currently China doesn't have enough incentive to invade Taiwan, or at least they recognize that there's a huge amount of global backlash they've received from invading Taiwan. This disincentivizes China to invade them because A, China is a trade-reliant economy, so if trade partners see the invasion, they will likely pull out because they don't want to pick a side in the conflict, and because they're also dependent, Taiwan is also economically dependent on China, but when they provide this assistance, this looks like helicopters coming in to pick people up. It looks like Chinese aid on the ground, including Chinese authorities on the ground, to ensure that aid or Chinese workers are not attacked, which means that for the short term, Taiwan is heavily reliant on Chinese money to help rebuild their area. B, in the long term, there's a lot of buildings and infrastructure that needs to be built back up, which means that China is likely to stay in the region for a long time because it gives them an incentive. I told you at setup, I'll also extend on this later. I think C, China is just going to pour money into Taiwan without wanting something back, right? They're not going to do this. China is likely to prod Taiwan in political situations because Taiwan has utilized their support and utilized their money to a great extent. This looks like Taiwan having to make political concessions because they are now in debt to China, right? Secondly, we tell you there's going to be military presence in the area because A, China is going to send military personnel to protect the aid from very extreme anti-Chinese activists, right? This looks like flying in through military planes and ships who have to hand out these emergency supplies and gradually increase this amount. And B, China wants Taiwanese to receive aid from them, right? Rather than handing this aid to the Taiwanese government, China wants to go in there by themselves because they have those bad incentives to invade the area, which means that they're going to give their aid in that in-person context, right? Thirdly, because a lot of Taiwanese businesses are requiring aid and probably struggling a bit, this allows the Chinese businesses to come in under the idea of support and to this damaged economy, right? This is a unique harm to their side of the house because when there's no Chinese aid, Chinese businesses would be shut down by Taiwanese locals because it is not perceived as aid or perceived as helping the economy. Comparatively, when China aids Taiwan, it is perceived as part of the operation or the business, operation of helping the businesses in the short term, of giving things to the people. And in the short term, we think this replaces local businesses that they're rebuilding in our worst case. This looks like China's construction companies coming in to rebuild and build companies and streets back up to the advantage. The impacts of this is that firstly, it leads to political control of China in the region, which means that China can take back, or at least have a pathway to take back China under their sovereignty. This means that years of family and Taiwanese values are destructed when their country has to revert and make cultural and political concessions to China. This like in a global context when they're having discussions between these countries where China is like, hey Taiwan, you should probably do this because we gave you this amount of money and we think that it's good that you should support us in this way. It means that world trade routes to Taiwan are cut off when the region is seen to be controlled by China or more politically contentious because people don't want to come into direct conflict with China themselves. We think that smaller countries that trade with Taiwan or are a part of the West are less likely to do this when they think that China is now Taiwan is reverting back to China. I'll take the POI now.
Okay, so if Taiwan has been like wrecked economically the way you tell us, how do you envisage that like these businesses and their economy is able to rebuild?
I'll get to that in my third point on how we get better aid. Secondly, on why this is in the best interest of the Taiwanese. For context, majority of the Taiwanese are against the idea of communism and being part of this one like China. Because firstly, Taiwanese had ancestors who migrated there to escape communism and the oppressive Chinese rule, right? Secondly, they've been told throughout their whole lives by the government, by their family, by their friends about why they should be separate, in which it is ingrained in their culture and their family values. It's like how Taiwanese celebrities refuse to engage in Chinese platforms and their contexts and like refuse to perform in China because they've been told throughout the whole lives and by the government as well. Thirdly, because they prefer a government that actually listens to them and gives them a say, other than one that has historically abused their country and also that country doesn't listen to their own citizens, right? I think firstly, the Taiwans have already suffered a natural disaster in which they already feel economically and politically vulnerable amidst the conflicts, amidst this natural disaster. They don't want to have this oppressive Chinese government coming in and be like, hey, we want to help, because they know that China has been a bad actor to them throughout history. Secondly, Taiwanese prefer to have aid from other countries and will get backlash against their own government decisions and point when they feel they're politically when there's political instability internally, where these people dislike their government for receiving aid from China. We think this makes them even more susceptible to the Chinese invasion. The impacts of this is that firstly, these young Taiwanese children or families have to live under Chinese control, or at least increased Chinese control, where their family values and national values have been undermined, they've been completely violated, where the streets may have been destroyed because of the earthquake. We feel like they're in a very vulnerable position, and putting a very harmful actor like China to help them is probably the worst thing you can do in that case. Thirdly, on how we get better aid them. Firstly, I think you're likely to still get aid from the UN because they have emergency relief and the UN is obligated to by their declarations, right? Secondly, other Western nations help because they care about humanitarian aid historically in comparison to China. Because China is one that historically does not use foreign aid unless it's to their advantage. Thirdly, we think China's likely to stay in the region for as long as possible, so they're probably going to give slower aid, right? Because their incentive is to control Taiwan, they're going to give minimal amounts of aid and then continue to build on that so they can be there for years and years, in which the people are still thinking, oh, but they're just helping us with the earthquake. Fourthly, we're told that the US will give aid to Taiwan, right? Because A, they are allies in which they both condemn China, and B, they want to get the economy back, the country back on track so they can continue to produce semiconductors that are really beneficial to the US. I think this is exclusive to our side of the house because they want to maintain these trade relations, whereas China just wants to control Taiwan. We get the better aid when we're able to prove that the US has better incentives and will actually provide the better aid in order to help these people.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome the first speaker of the negative team.
a state of subsistence, despair and depression, Taiwan seeks quick, quality and vital assistance. We think the Taiwanese people are justified in demanding the fastest assistance because they can only be expected to struggle for so long. A few things to do in the speech. 3 arguments. Firstly, on how we get important aid to the Taiwanese people. Secondly, how public buy-in, how we get good public buy-in of Taiwanese people. And lastly, Nathan's going to talk to you about the international optics here. I'm going to go into a few pieces of setup and then respond to what we've heard substantively so far from side Affirmative. Firstly then, what do we think China's incentives are? We think that most of the material we would agree with here, but we also want to reinforce that China wants to look good on a national stage. This means that they want to show off their regional power and their ability to have influence and the fact that they have money. They want to show people that they do have some form of good and that they can reinforce other countries. Note they have lots of money to provide this aid to look good and retain power. This means that they want to satisfy their burden, or they want to satisfy their incentives of showing off their power, and notice that they also have the ability to do this so that they'll likely do. What does this Chinese aid look like? We agree mostly with what we've heard so far, but we think that it looks like sending in humanitarian aid workers, fixing key infrastructure like roads, and providing medical aid, etc. Note that this aid is so important in the sense that they need it quickly. We don't think that we have enough time to continuously wait for the US or wait for the UN to come and give us aid. More on that later. But note also that we say that we have a duty to the Taiwanese people to provide them with assistance to protect human life. Ultimately, we think that providing them with assistance and minimizing the cost to human life is the most important thing. What is our path to victory in this then? It's proving that we most efficiently save Taiwanese lives and work towards rebuilding. But first, on feasibility on how Taiwan is likely to maintain independence. Note this is a point in feasibility on how this is actually going to work. Context here. Taiwan is becoming more democratically centered and moving toward Western ideals. 4 ways then we think that Taiwan is able to maintain independence. Firstly, Taiwan has massive US backing in the sense that when China goes in to give Taiwan some sort of assistance, we say that they're not likely to engage in extreme forms of power in the sense that they have so much Western backing. Secondly, it's their country in the sense that when they have other companies and aid workers coming in from China to go into Taiwan, we say that because it's their country, they have some form of power to eject them from their country. They know the land best and they have powers within there. Thirdly, China probably seeks to retain diplomacy and avoid war. But we say that even if they did go into war, that they'll be conceding that they don't have control over Taiwan. What this means is that it operates against their incentive in the sense that they don't want to engage in this war with Taiwan because it looks bad on a national stage. That doesn't work out with all of their incentives. What is our worst case then? It's that China exerts soft power and becoming friendlier. They try to become friendlier with the Taiwanese people. They might place tariffs or they ask for some sort of repayment and recompense. This is our worst case scenario in the sense that if you don't believe any of this, that they don't maintain independence, we tell you that we're still able to get them with the aid that they want. Now then, onto a few responses as to what we've heard thus far. We've been told that Taiwan is a really vulnerable country because it's so close to China. First response here, we don't think that this vulnerability is so special in the sense that they have such powerful Western backing. China's not going to want to go to the war with Taiwan for a few reasons. Firstly, because of their incentive of not wanting to concede that they do not have power over Taiwan, but secondly as well, because they have US backing and Western backing in the sense that China doesn't want to get into a war with the Western world. Also then, what we've heard on how they get better aid and how they're going to get aid from the UN. Firstly, I just don't think that Taiwan's in the UN in the sense that they don't have an obligation to give aid to Taiwan. And we say that this aid isn't better because it takes longer to get to Taiwan. In the sense that because China is so close to Taiwan, this means that they can get people over to Taiwan as quickly as possible. Alternatively, they have to be waiting weeks for ships to come over, for these construction companies to come over. They simply do not have the time. Now then, onto my first substantive point on how we get important aid. A bit of context here. Being geographically close and sharing many cultural similarities, we think China is uniquely placed to provide aid. Note that we are working on a time metric, as the time immediately after the earthquake is when we are trapped. In this sense, we need to be saved, and we want to be saved, and we want to receive this assistance as quickly as possible. A few ways that we get important aid. Firstly, Chinese aid workers have language and cultural similarities. The people in these isolated cultural areas are far less likely to speak English, so having this sort of removed cultural and language barrier, we think that's really important in the sense that they have some sort of relatability to the Taiwanese people. Secondly, China is the closest nation to Taiwan. This means that if we think that the time metric is the most important thing, which I think is really important, in the sense that these Taiwanese people don't want to be stuck under rubble and stuck in a bad situation for long periods of time. If we're able to give them the quickest aid possible, we're likely to get the most buy-in there, but we also get the important aid that they want because they're so close. Thirdly, China is really large and has lots and lots of money and manpower, in the sense that because they're so close and because they have so much money and so much power and because it operates within their incentives, we tell you that they're likely to provide really, really good aid. Fourthly, we say that China probably has really good geographic knowledge of Taiwan, in the sense that it used to be under China, in the sense that these aid workers and the experts that are going in here have lots of good knowledge. Fifthly, when other, particularly like the US, see Taiwan receiving aid from China, they have an incentive to provide more of their own aid, and there's some sort of competition between these two countries on who can provide Taiwan with the most aid. Ultimately, we say that Taiwan is likely to continue siding with the US because of their democratic ideals. The outcomes here is that aid is quicker, so that more people are rescued from the rubble, initially saving more lives. Aid can be distributed as there is a cultural and language similarities, in the sense that there's no barrier between the people. The impacts here is that this is really, really important, in the sense that the government has a duty to protect and care for the people, and this can be done the most quickly and the most effectively by receiving this important aid. Now then, on to my last point on how we get Taiwanese buy-in. A bit of context here. We say that they're in the most desperate conditions and probably hungry and paid and displaced from their homes, workplaces and lands. What do they care about? They care about being pulled from the rut of despair and receiving aid in their children and their families. We tell you that this is responsive internal material, in the sense that they care so much more about getting their children safe and out of the rubble than they care about their family and cultural ties. We say that ultimately it doesn't matter if it means that you're harming human life. Few mechanisms here. Firstly, because they actually get help. This means that because that's quick and because it's fast, they like it. Secondly, because the government is able to give them reassurance, they tell them, hey, we have Western backing, we're still able to retain democracy. Thirdly, rurals care less about geopolitical tensions, in the sense that people who live in the middle of the mountains aren't going to care about the geopolitical tensions than the people in the city would. These are the people who are the most affected, who we should care the most about. The outcomes and the benefits here is that Taiwanese people are happy and in the highest demand of this aid. We get less outrage at the institution and people feel less disenfranchised, in the sense that we get the impact of bringing aid to the people and saving lives. So proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now invite the second speaker from the affirmative team.
The negating side of the House fails to prove why the Taiwanese people are likely to collaborate with their #1 enemy rather than someone who has been backing them for so long and can provide them with quick and even more better aid in time that is just so much quicker. Okay, three main things in my speech today. First, on which side gets better aid for Taiwanese people. Secondly, on the interests of the people. And then finally, I'm going to split and talk about why accepting aid is harmful for the entire region around Taiwan and for the world as a whole. Okay, firstly then, on which side gets better aid. We tell you on our side of the House that we get better aid once we have the UN and the US providing this aid. The negating side of the House agrees that Taiwan has long-standing ties with the U.S. and they have extremely strong backing. I do not understand why then it is unlikely that the U.S. is going to be providing aid. If they are so tightly linked with Taiwan, it is likely then that they actually care about Taiwan and they actually want to get the country back up and running. It is unlikely that China has these same incentives because of China's long-standing, internationally known goal to be invading Taiwan. It is very well known internationally that China wants to take over Taiwan, and they just have really hostile relationships because of these geopolitical tensions. This does not exist on our side of the house, where the U.S. actually wants to establish Taiwanese independence, where the U.S. actually wants to get the country back up and running. Everything we hear on their side of the house about how they're going to be having faster aid because there's a language barrier when the UN provides it is absolutely ridiculous. Because why would someone in the UN not have someone who can speak Taiwanese, right? It's this multinational organization. The fact that everyone in the US and the UN just doesn't only speak English is like an entire oversight on their side of the house about the absolute multinational scale of these regions, right? The language barrier simply isn't enough to prove that they're going to be getting better aid. Whereas on our side of the house, we are getting aid that is infinitely quicker. Everything they tell us about is just going to be quicker on their side of the house because China is really closely. Now I feel like they're completely disregarding the fact that there are planes, like the US can fly over to Taiwan, they still can get really fast aid, and the UN can also do this. We saw it when we saw the earthquake in Turkey and in Syria, where the UN was able to deliver aid extremely quickly, and they can do the exact same thing with Taiwan. And geographically speaking, the US isn't too far from Taiwan because the world is a globe and they're really close to each other, right? So the distance isn't all too different. The aid gets there just as quick, if not quicker, because of the extremely strong backing and because of just the overall better incentives, and is overall because there is stronger backing and the relationship between the two is just overall better. We finally hear that China just knows China knows Taiwanese geographics because they had invaded in the past, right? Now, why then is the US and the UN likely to get the same, if not better, knowledge of the area? Now, it is likely they're going to get the same thing in the way that in our worst case, they can open up Google Maps and see the area. But in the most likely case, they're going to be able to collaborate with the Taiwanese government because of these really strong relations, where the US can actually go and communicate with the government, where they know where the vulnerable people are, and they can actually get a better understanding of who is trapped within the mountains. On their side of the house, the Chinese government then has to operate on their own due to backlash from the Taiwanese government, where the Taiwanese government does not accept Chinese aid, and they simply just reject any aid. So they're going to have to operate on their own, where they get even worse geopolitical, geographic knowledge because there is no collaboration, and they have to go off 100-year-old maps from when Taiwan was invaded by China. Okay, what else then do we hear? We also hear that they can maintain, and we hear a small point about how they can maintain independence because they're slowly becoming more democratic and they have massive U.S. backing. Now, since we have that massive U.S. backing, they're going to get aid first. They also cannot be controlling the politics because U.S. has an incentive to have Taiwan independent because they want it to be long-standing by itself, because the alternative, it is held by arguably their number one enemy, where they will not have any help from these countries. And finally, we see that the U.S. is unlikely then going to be backing Taiwan if they take Chinese aid, because they'll see this as a massive betrayal. Once Taiwan collaborates with the Chinese government, they will take this as a massive slap in the face and will no longer want to be backing Taiwan as much because they saw that they were betrayed by this country. They finally tell us, okay, before I move on, I'll take a point.
Do you think that the USA aid is exclusive to your side of the house, or can it occur on both sides?
We think that it is exclusive to our side of the house for the reason that it is unlikely that the U.S. is going to be collaborating with Chinese aid because of this tension between the two countries. If China goes in to give aid, the U.S. then will not be giving aid because of the issues between the two countries. It is extremely unlikely that we're going to be having Chinese corporations collaborating with U.S. corporations because of the issues between the two. This is why it is completely exclusive to our side of the house, where it is China is a really controversial country and is unlikely going to be getting international backing, whereas the U.S. has more control over the entire world, where they can get more countries backing it. So Western nations see the U.S. is helping them, they're likely then to be contributing to the fund because the Western world as a whole benefits from Taiwanese independence and benefits when they are the ones helping them get back on their track. We also get better aid in the way where Katie told you at first, and it was completely under-responded to on their side of the house, where on our side, where China is likely going to try to stay in the country as long as possible. Their aid looks looks like them going in and slowly helping the country bit by bit to establish as much control as possible over the area. However, the US and the UN want to get the country back up and independent as quickly as possible because they benefit when Taiwan is independent, and they benefit when the infrastructure back in Taiwan gets back quicker. China, however, benefits so much more if there is a long-standing Chinese presence, so their aid is likely to be so much worse where they're going to be hand-feeding slowly, bit by bit, to ensure they stay in there as long as possible. Secondly then, on why we get more, why the interests of the people are better on our side of the house. They tell us that there's going to be more buying because they want aid. We get the same aid, if not better, on our side of the house. However, on our side of the house, we see that the young Taiwanese boy whose parents were killed in this earthquake then doesn't have to grow up and work in a Shein sweatshop because now his country has been invaded by this Chinese Communist Party. On our side of the house, we see that they can grow up and see collaboration with a country that's been long supported by their parents and rather not have to lose everything and be under a country that has consistently been told to them as a child that is horrible and hates them and just hates everything about their independence. They also tell us that the people in the mountains, they do not care about the democracy and they will not care if it is taken over. They will be caring once China goes in and controls all their resources. Once China gets foot in, they're not only going to care about the people in the cities, they're likely going to be expanding to the entire Taiwanese island where they're going to be going in and getting the resources from all areas. The people in the mountains are the most vulnerable people. They're going to be most affected if they do not get effective aid from the US, as we see on our side of the house, where on their side of the house, we only see Chinese control, ineffective aid, and just overall really horrible repercussions. Finally then, on my split on why accepting the aid is really harmful to the entire region and the world as a whole. Now, we already told you that accepting aid opens up a path of dependency between China and Taiwan, as it gives China more control over the Chinese maritime area and just land. Likely that they're not going to be giving this for free, and they're going to be controlling the region to an extent at our worst. So why is this firstly harmful for the region? We see the Chinese then will be controlling the South Sea and the ocean mess between China and Taiwan, and they're likely then going to be less willing to let others trade in the area, because before, China was allowing countries like Japan and South Korea to be trading in the area. Once China takes control over this, since they want to be like an economic superpower over the world, it is likely then they're going to be cutting this off from the world and maintaining the utmost control. Why then it also gives them liberty then to exploit Taiwanese resources. It is also harmful for the world as a whole, because then they're going to be taking a bunch of resources under the pretense that they are helping. This looks like sending in construction companies to be focusing on building infrastructure, while at the same time stealing semiconductors and stealing resources, and overall this is just really harmful. Once they have this complete control, countries like the UK and the US will not be able to get this stuff, making it they're going to be pricing really, really highly, where the UK and the US and Western nations will have to be buying this stuff at really expensive prices, overall really harmful to the Western world and the Eastern world once China has overall control. Since we are the side that stands with wanting to help Taiwan, stand for such.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome the second speaker of the negative team.
When your options are between having millions of people in your country suffering from a deadly earthquake or allowing a big superpower to come in and help you and give you wonderful, amazing aid, we think on side negating that you should choose the aid. A couple of things for you in this speech. Firstly, the idea of China's incentive and what's going to be the impacts on Taiwan. Secondly, the impacts on Taiwanese under that, the impacts on Taiwanese people. Secondly, on aid, who gets the best aid, and then thirdly, I'm going to split on the international optics, and under that, responding to most of the international material there. So firstly, then on China's incentive of control and what's going to happen when China comes in with this aid. What was their big push here? Firstly, it was that China was going to do this aid extremely slowly, and they were just going to hold and seize control over this. I have a few responses to this. Firstly, we see that China exists a soft power whenever they offer aid to developing countries, and wherever in the world they may offer it. We don't think that this is going to be different in Taiwan. We think it's going to be fairly similar. This soft power does not equate to absolute total control. Note that all of when they were offered when they offered Taiwan aid before, there were literally no big conditions on this. But also secondly, if other analysis here was that like China's going to like do it as slow as possible. Firstly, we think that China has a specific incentive to build as fast as possible to rebuild Taiwan because they want to appear as good and efficient as possible. This looks really good for them because if China can show that they can like they're very good, they're very efficient, they can rebuild economies faster, that's really beneficial for the China's image, and that is what China wants. China wants to look as good on the world stage as possible. Secondly, if they stay for a very long time, like even if you want to buy that material at the end of that, like people in Taiwan themselves are going to get fed up. They're going to demand China to do it faster. They are going to do this. Why do we expect this to happen? Firstly, just because like if they're going to stay for like 20 years, like building all of the infrastructure like they say on the side affirming, then like the Taiwanese people in the government are just going to be absolutely fed up. They're going to demand more. But we think that at that point in time, enough is going to recover that like Taiwanese like construction companies and like Taiwanese industries may have returned to similar levels before, so they can also contribute and rebuild, thus like not needing as much China power as possible. And then also on the material about like businesses coming in and like setting up shop like a Shein factory in China. Firstly, we just want to like think that it's just not feasible for Chinese businesses to like move and set up like different branches in Taiwan. Firstly, because like massive costs exist already there. These businesses probably don't want to go to like an earthquake-torn country because that's just like a horrible place for business. Like nothing's going to be great there. But even if you want to think that, like companies taking over like big businesses, like we think that lots of Chinese companies, the ones that are able to do this, are probably very wealthy and they're going to be very beneficial. If people can work there and if people can like, this creates jobs and also like it contributes wonderfully for the Taiwan economy. We think that material mitigates a lot of the harms there because the businesses that are able to have the like capital to do so. What do we ultimately prove at the end of this point then? Firstly, we prove that like a lot of the material is just severely mitigated and how China's just like going to like take control over China. This means that like this loses significant weighting power in this debate, and also that it's just like it doesn't really benefit. So then onto like who gets better aid. What was their big push here? Firstly, it was that like under their side of the house, their counter was just like the UN's going to come in and the US is going to do it. Firstly, I want to flag here that the UN is like relatively useless, right? Like the UN is extremely slow. They take forever. Like they use the Syrian example of the earthquake. I want to know that it took like days for the UN to come in, and by that time like the harm was already done. We don't think that the UN is going to be able to do so, but also when it comes to the UN, when they do their big bureaucratic processes, they have to do a big vote. Because like a lot of countries are very like anti-Taiwan, we think that a lot of countries might veto and object to that. This means it's just going to slow down the process as a whole. That means that like aid from Taiwan is probably not going to be super beneficial, but also on the material about like how like these Chinese people are able to like come in from China and communicate well, understand the culture of Taiwan. Not their only big push here was that like, oh, the UN has people that can speak Mandarin as well. A couple of responses here. Firstly, we think that like not all UN workers are going to be able to speak Mandarin. The sheer scale of just like majority Chinese people coming into the country and helping is going to be far more easier than having like 100 as opposed to like 1,000 from China. But also, what else? Like, the big push about like how China, against our China has a good understanding of Taiwan and how like under our side of the house, China's going to use like 100-year-old maps. We just want to sense check this, right? Like, China can use Google Maps too, okay? Like, that's not a really exclusive benefit. But also, we think that like, inherently China does a lot of surveillance of Taiwan. They have very wonderful understanding of the geography of China. That means that they're able to access these smaller regions, whether like they want to or not. But also, they're like, no government wants to communicate with China. We think that's just like against the incentive of Taiwan. If Taiwan brings in the Chinese government and they're like, we need your help, that means that they're going to communicate with them and they're going to work together with them. Because what use is it just like saying, hey, please help us, we're not going to talk to you about anything. Like, we think that's just ridiculous. We think that all of their cooperation benefits and stuff exist under our side of the house. I'll take it from you, now.
Okay, you told us then that the Taiwanese people will be demanding China to finish quicker. Why do you think that a mountain farmer is likely to be able to push out the world superpower that is China?
But we don't think just a mountain farmer is going to push them out. Like, we think that collectively, as a whole country, they're going to want to push it out. That just falls. So then, onto like the idea of Taiwanese people as a whole. Firstly, like all of their material about like there's an ingrained like hatred towards China and how they hate China. Like we think that exists on either side of the house. But when your options and weighing up are literally like having millions of your own people suffering, or having to put like a petty put like your small resentment aside in order to get this out. We think the majority of people are going to have to weigh this up because one is human life and the other one is just a struggle. We think that that means we can get the interest of Taiwan, but also we think that there's like a unique avenue here that we can like reduce massive tensions and that like Taiwanese people and Chinese people no longer have like massive like beef with each other, and that like we reduce this, and that's quite beneficial because we don't have that massive hatred. Ultimately, at the end of all of this, I think we've proved that on the outside of the house we get good aid, and this is really beneficial because under the comparative they've just got the US and the UN, and I've proved as to why like that is just not useful. But also, what does this mean about how we get better aid and why it's so beneficial? That means we fulfill our duty that Tyler gave you at first. That adds significant weight and power to all of that material, and it's so beneficial. So then, on like international optics of the like Taiwan accepting help from China. So then, what do we have to understand at the beginning of this point? Firstly, is like China is one of the biggest current geopolitical. China-Taiwan is one of the biggest geopolitical tensions. That means it's really like watched on the world stage by like most countries in the world. And so here's why, because due to these optics that like everyone's going to act in their best incentive. Firstly, China has a very specific incentive to appear as like charitable and benevolent as possible in the eyes of developing nations. This is because they want developing nations to reach out to China and be like, hey, I saw what you did with Taiwan. We want help as well. That is really good because China can now expand their influence that Tyler gave you as an incentive in first. Secondly, Taiwan relies heavily on international optics and that like it needs as many states as possible to recognize them as a state. Therefore, if Taiwan is probably not going to be looked at very well, if they're like going like, I don't want help from China because I'm being petty, like that's how other countries are probably going to perceive it. That's not a good image for Taiwan. Thirdly, Western liberal nations such as the USA and like Australia, they probably like are very anti-China. That means like if they see China going in, they want to like aid them as well, and they want to like compete with them and like have a war, or like have like a soft cold war, and that like they want to give as much aid as possible to reduce influence. We think that that means that like because of that we like get best aid that like pertains to most of the material about like no aid from like the US. Outcomes, what do we prove at this point? We prove that like on the international scales, everyone behaves in their best interest. This is so important because we get the most aid under our side of the house.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now welcome the third speaker of the Affirmative team.
The last thing that the people of Taiwan want is for their children to be born into a country in which people like them are oppressed and exploited by a massive country to whom they have no comparative power, particularly not at the cost of potentially receiving a bit of aid a day or two earlier. The most important thing here is maintaining Taiwan's sovereignty and independence from China, because that is the biggest harm that China poses in this debate. If both sides get any form of aid, and even if you buy that they get their aid slightly quicker, we tell you we still win on the harm of independence. So 2 things to cover in the speech. Firstly on independence, and secondly on who gets better aid. We tell you that independence is the most important thing here, and they never really try to contest our material. We tell you that like when the future of Taiwan is at risk here, because like China has the potential to come over and take over the country, exploit Taiwanese people and their resources. We tell you that that is the last thing that Taiwan wants, particularly if the only benefit that Ned can claim comparatively here is like getting some food in a couple days quicker. Couple of things to cover on independence here. Firstly, we hear that actually they get better independence because Taiwan has like a massive US backing, so China's like never going to try to take over Taiwan. Firstly, US backing doesn't stop China from like implicitly taking control through like injecting businesses and working themselves in from the inside. It's not like one massive hostile event, right? So we tell you that US backing isn't really going to change anything here. But secondly, as we told you at second, the US doesn't want to like start any form of conflict with China. There's a lot more at stake here than their trade connections with Taiwan. The US cares about themselves like a lot here. And so like if China's involved as well, they're not going to want to risk anything. The second thing we hear is that like, oh, it's Taiwan's own country. They have the power to eject this like massive power. Three responses here. Firstly, there's just not a lot of Taiwanese people. China has billions of people, right? Like, Taiwan's military is considerably more vulnerable to like any form of control from China. We say that they can like never just eject an entire military that's like scales of magnitude stronger than them. But secondly, we show you Taiwan doesn't have the economic power, right? China is one of the biggest economic powers in the world. They have the power to like control or overthrow any attempt that Taiwan ever makes. But thirdly, and most importantly here, the Taiwanese people become reliant on this aid they're getting from China. They can't just simply stop taking it, because obviously they need aid. Both sides agree on that. Note that there's minimal engagement with our key mechanism that China is incentivized to maintain full control over all the aid that's provided, because obviously they want to take control over Taiwan. And also we tell you that the US doesn't really want to collaborate with China. That leads to like controversy and stuff. That wasn't responded to. This is why our material about the US or the UN is mutually exclusive. They can't just try to claim all of our benefits here. The third thing we hear is that China never wants, doesn't want to go to war, so isn't going to invade Taiwan or take any control over it. Note that this literally ignores all our characterization about why this is exactly why China is incentivized to be inefficient in their aid provision, to get into Taiwan from the inside out, to have control without having to go through this military method. Note that this method from China receives far less international backlash because the optics make it look like China is helping. China is never engaging in literal war crimes either way. So at the end of this point then, we proved that by not receiving aid from by not receiving aid from China, Taiwan is successfully able to maintain their independence, maintain their sovereignty. We tell you, even if that is at the cost of receiving aid a couple days earlier, that's the most important thing here. That's what the future generations of Taiwan are concerned about. That's what we're concerned about in this debate. Nextly then on aid. Note that this is the only path to victory from the other side, and so if they don't win on this, they don't win the debate. I think the most important thing to cover at the top of this point is that we never actually hear any indication on the comparative scale of how much better this aid is going to be. Note that on either side, the largest economic harms of the roads and buildings being destroyed, and the most lives being lost when these buildings fall on the people, happen when the earthquake occurs. So at best here, providing aid never actually has this massive impact of saving the lives of people, right? We tell you that in a couple of days never has the impact of a massive change in economic rebuilding, because either way the massive harms occur when the earthquake occurs. So we tell you that they never really can claim these benefits to the scale that they want to. That mitigates literally all of their material here. I'll take a point from it.
I gave you material as to why Western liberal states have the specific incentive to give more aid when China gives aid as well. How does your material interact with that?
We told you that the US doesn't want to doesn't want to collaborate with China because of the fact that China is a relatively controversial country. The US has their own image to protect. On top of that, and also we told you that China has incentive to provide enough aid that other countries don't need to because they want to maintain their control. We don't really think that that's realistic. First thing we hear No, thank you. The first thing we hear from Neg is that Chinese aid workers have cultural similarities and therefore you get better aid. You simply just don't need to have similar cultures to provide aid. Even if you buy that China and Taiwan are really similar, we just don't see the link here to getting better aid. We take that in order to build a road or build build a building, you don't need to speak the same language as people there. It looks even if there are no cultural differences in these practices, they're pretty objective. The most important thing is just getting the aid in the first place. Note that we also gave you material about there's always going to be some people who can provide these cultural similarities from the US or the UN. Even if not every person at the UN speaks Mandarin, there's obviously going to be some, because we're an international organization. They're just going to send the people that do speak Taiwan over. The second thing we hear is that China's really close to Taiwan, and that leads to considerably quicker aid. Firstly, the US has other countries have ways of getting to Taiwan quicker. A plane is at worst taking a couple of hours to get there. We tell you that even if China is considerably closer to Taiwan by such a massive margin, we tell you that the biggest possible difference here is like a couple of hours, maybe like a day. But secondly, we tell you that China actually takes longer because they have other incentives that they conceded to, which means that they have to like include military operations. They're probably going to like have helicopters coming in and things like that. We tell you that that's why China's never even actually quicker than the others. The next thing we hear is that China's setting up businesses in Taiwan's actually good because it like leads to like establishing jobs and stuff. We told you at first that China can let these construction companies to like slowly come in and take the jobs and roles, right? We tell you that all it takes is like building one road, and then like you build the street lamps, and then you build the buildings. We say that like expands really quickly, particularly given that these Chinese businesses are so powerful, are so strong, have way more like economies of scale, and can be considerably more effective than these Taiwanese companies. They're like considerably more likely to take control here. But like we also tell you, as we like noted in the first point of fact, that these Taiwanese people being employed by Chinese employers is never good. That we tell you that leads to like exploitation and stuff like that. That's never something that we want on our side of the house. The next thing we hear is that China's large and has money and manpower. Firstly, they're not the only big country. Every other country, like lots of other countries, have manpower and money. That's not mutually exclusive. But secondly, we tell you that like we get better aid when the US has economic incentives in comparison to China's political incentives, which they're obviously driven by. The last thing I'll cover here is on public buy-in. Note that all their material here is literally reliant on the fact that they get better aid. So if you don't buy that they get better aid, they don't get better public buy-in. But even if there is some benefit to buy-in from having faster aid, we tell you that this is considerably outweighed by the majority of the nation feeling oppressed and exploited by a country who they know wants to invade them. Everyone in Taiwan knows that a country wants to invade them. Just because like China, at their best, appears like they're being friendly, the Taiwanese people know their incentives, they feel exploited. That's not something we can stand for in this debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I welcome the third speaker of the negative team.
If Taiwan is so vulnerable to China, then why hasn't China already taken them over? Clearly there are reasons, and we don't think these reasons go away just because of an earthquake and just because Taiwan accepts some aid. 3 things I'm going to be doing for you in my speech today. Firstly, basically seeing will Taiwan get invaded by China and taken over? Secondly, on better aid, and thirdly, on public optics. So firstly, kind of on like, what will this aid look like from China? Do we think they're just going to take them over? I'm going to start by going over some incentives. So firstly, we have China, and we've been told from this, but they're going to be a bad actor who wants to take over Taiwan. We tell you that, that China has this like alternative incentive, that they want to look really good and friendly to Taiwan. We tell you that the reason they haven't taken Taiwan over yet is because every person in this country is so opposed to them and hates them, therefore they have an incentive to look really friendly and like they're not about to take them over, because this is the point where they receive a lot of aggression and their aid isn't well received at all. This means that they want to they will not be sending in for example their soldiers with lots of guns. They're way more likely to come in and try and look as nice and friendly as possible, because this is when they can win over the Taiwanese people. They're not going to do that when they're sending in their tanks. Secondly, we think that China needs to have this aid accepted, because that's how they can improve their optics with Taiwan. So they're really reliant upon Taiwan to actually say, yes, we'll accept this aid. As we've heard from both sides of the house, Taiwan can just get it from the USA if they want. This means that Taiwan holds all the cards. So they can say, no, you can't send in your tanks. No, you can't send in your massive military helicopters. And basically you can't send in your government, your businesses who are going to take over our businesses. Ultimately, we tell you that when these aid workers and when these troops are in Taiwanese territory, Taiwan holds
holds the cards. We've heard from why is like Taiwan able to like have this power? Because we've agreed from both sides that they have backing from the US. This doesn't go away. Taiwan at the end of the day still has the incentives to maintain their independence, and so they're going to be really careful and really selective about the types of aid they send in. And we don't think, but we still think China would be willing to like go in under any conditions, because at the end of the day they want to win over the Taiwanese people. So at the end of this, we've established that like the type of aid that Side F has told you they're going to be sending in is just not realistic, because Taiwan won't let it happen. They don't want to like be taken over by China. And at the end of the day, we tell you that like considering that Taiwan hasn't already been invaded by China, the US isn't simply going to go away. More on that later. Okay, so secondly, on better aid, what we've heard here is that USA is exclusive to their side of the house. So why is, and we've heard in their main line of analysis they gave you here, is that USA is not going to want to work with the Chinese government and corporations. Let's do a little like weigh up of the probabilities. We tell you that that the USA is going to dislike the fact that China and Taiwan are getting closer way more than the fact that they might have to be like involved in the like on the same island as Taiwan. This means that they now have a unique incentive to try and outcompete China with the aid. So on their outside of the house, we get more aid, because now they want to show that they are like show to the Taiwanese people that they are so much better, that they are so more efficient. So at the very worst, we get symmetric amounts of aid. We get the same amount of aid from the US. However, we tell you on our side of the house, it's far more likely we get more aid, and this aid is going to be more efficient from the US, because now they have like this double incentive to not only look good to Taiwan, but look better than China. And then and then we have these other specific reasons we've given you on why we think that Chinese aid can uniquely benefit Taiwan. So firstly on speed, and that they can actually get their people faster. Why is this? Firstly, because even if we have the USA is unfortunately, well not unfortunately, but they're hampered by democratic processes. We've already seen this in situations like trying to send bills of aid to Ukraine, where it's been like where Republicans have debated about it, and it's taken like days and days to get through. Obviously, USA has really good incentives to try and stop Russia taking over, but even then, they can't get their aid fast. On the other hand, China is an autocratic nation, so they can just do whatever they want and get their aid over straight away. They don't have to debate it for ages. And secondly, we've heard, we think that Taiwan's just China is just closer. We've heard, this plane was like plane, so it won't take long. We tell you that in the end, those hours where it takes longer to get from the USA matter, and the fact that like in the first hours after an earthquake, that is when people are stuck and dying. If we can get them out and save them and get them out 3 hours earlier, they are far more likely to be alive. So we think we get more lives saved on our side of the house. And the third push we've heard there is, China has this incentive to try and to dribble out their aid and make it go really slowly so they can stay in the country. Why does this not exist? Because ultimately now we have USA and Chinese aid. If the USA is going nice and quickly and efficiently, China also has the same incentive. Otherwise the Taiwanese people who are like getting the Chinese aid are going to be like, well, you guys suck compared to the USA. And this is obviously not something that China wants. I'll take your point now.
I'm a Taiwanese person who knows that China has the motive of taking over my country. Would I rather aid being a bit earlier, or have this aid provided by a country that I know has positive incentives?
When being there a bit earlier means that your son's life is saved because they're pulled from the rubble, we think you would far prefer that. So then secondly, another reason why we think Chinese aid is better is language. We've heard already that, some people from the USA and the UN speak Chinese. We tell you that their 5 Chinese people or something is not enough to get aid to hundreds of villages, firstly. And secondly, not specifically in the US military, Chinese people are discriminated against, so you're likely to have really low numbers of people there. So why is this important? We've heard, it doesn't really matter. We tell you it's really important to communicate with the local people when you're building their roads, when you're doing all these things. The Taiwanese people are far more likely to feel like they have some kind of control over their aid rebuilding, when they can actually talk to the people and figure out what they're doing. When you have foreigners coming in who don't speak your language, who don't understand your customs, this is when you're far more likely to get communication mishaps. And also simply the fact that you can't understand what they're saying. When if you're a US person who speaks no Mandarin, and then some Taiwanese person comes up to you and they're trying to tell you that my child is trapped over there, we think if they're not speaking the same language, it's far harder to just do simple things like this. And thirdly, we've heard we have geographical knowledge. Firstly, the push we've had is that Google Maps exists. No, these regions are really remote and isolated. They cut off from the internet, so they can't just use Google Maps.
at the very least, we think that both sides have like the symmetric ability to like have the same geographical knowledge. We tell you where we uniquely get better outcomes is that China also has a lot of like really isolated mountainous villages that do not exist in the same way in the USA. The geography is way more similar, and that they also just be better equipped to deal with this like unique geographical situation. So they have better knowledge. So finally on manpower, we've heard that like lots of countries have a lot of people. We tell you that China, however, has specific incentives to try and help Taiwan, so they're likely to send in these people in a way that other nations won't. So clearly at the end of this, we've proven we get better aid on our side of the house, which we think is the most important thing. And now I'm going to move on to public optics. We know that this is partially contingent on my better aid, but I think I've proven that. We've heard this characterization. Firstly, I'd like to establish this characterization that rural people are not as politically involved, they're not as connected to their local government and the geopolitical kind of tensions there. So we've heard there that ultimately we think that people are not going to care about getting their aid like a few days earlier. Three responses here. Firstly, we tell you yes they do, and that a few days can be the difference between life and death. At the end of the day, people want to live and they want their kids to live. And secondly, we tell you this is a trade-off and we think people are far more likely to want the aid. And thirdly, we tell you that the Taiwanese government can look really strong when they seem to control China and build relations on their terms, which is why it's going to be accepted across Taiwan. At the end of this debate, we think we get better outcomes for Taiwan. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech. As customary, we now switch the speaking orders. I welcome the leader of the negative team to get their reply.
Insofar as we're able to prove that firstly, Taiwan is able to maintain its independence, secondly, that we get better aid and we're able to get aid from the US that is probably more competitive and proportionately better, and thirdly, because we're able to show you that the public perception isn't so bad that they're going to say no to China because they don't care about their kids under the rubble staying there for another day, we don't think that's good enough from their side. Three areas of clash then in this debate. Firstly, on which side has better aid. Secondly, what this aid will look like. And then lastly, sort of on public perception. Note this is sort of a minor point in the sense that if we can prove that we get better outcomes for humanitarian aid, we're able to minimise the cost to human life and human harms, then we're able to win on that. Firstly then, on which side gets better aid. Note that we say this is the most important point in this debate, in the sense that if we're able to prove that we are able to minimise the human risk in this case, and we're also able to prove that the people are better off, then we can win on that. On this then, on which side gets better aid? We heard from AF substantively that the US loves democracy and that it's really, really good that they get aid to Taiwan because they have really good incentives. We also said that China has relatively good incentives in the sense that they want to look good on the international stage, that they want to make sure that people that developing nations around the world are happy with the sort of performance that they're putting on. Ultimately, we say this US and UN aid that they're talking about is not exclusive. This is in the sense that the white racists in the US don't want to provide aid to Taiwan, but as soon as China's in the question, it's like, yay, let's compete against China. That's really good. Ultimately, because we're able to prove that these people are much more likely to buy into competitive provisions of aid, that means that we get more aid and better aid. But even if we don't get this US aid, we tell you that Taiwan is closer to China. Even if the world is a sphere and not flat, we tell you that ultimately we have to contend with the fact that China is actually closer to Taiwan. This means that the planes get to Taiwan faster than we are going to see in the US. Ultimately, because we can bring you faster, probably better aid, because they have these incentives of looking good on the international stage, we're able to prove that we get better aid. So the outcomes of this then is that we're able to prove that in the very worst scenario, the outcomes of aid is symmetric, but in our more likely case, we're able to prove that because we have these competitive provisions of aid, we're able to prove that we get better aid overall then. The impacts here is that we're able to win this debate because we prove that the humanitarian cost is far reduced under our side, in the sense that the parents get their kids out of the rubble faster. Now then, on what this aid will look like. We told you substantively through our case that China's key incentives are to look good on an international stage and to sort of be good people. We don't think that China is inherently evil in the sense that they just hate everyone and they don't want to do anything good. We say that's just like an outlandish stance that we've heard from Aff throughout the bench, in the sense that, yeah, China's just so evil and they want to take over Taiwan all the time. Look, we just think that's disproportionate, representation of what China's incentives actually are, in the sense that they can just give aid and not go to invade them. We told you throughout the bench that because, they told you, oh my god, China has all this power, guys. They're going to go into Taiwan, they're going to invade it, they're going to take over, there's going to be this super huge communist revolution. Why haven't they done it already? Because, there's no incentive to, because they have these counteracting incentives to look good on an international stage. We tell you that that's much more likely the incentive that they're going to buy into, because no one's going to work with them if they go in and they choose to fight against Taiwan. Also, they have massive US and Western backing, in the sense that when China goes to war with Taiwan, it means that they concede that they don't have control over Taiwan, but it also means that they have to go to war with the Western world, which is just something Xi Jinping doesn't want to do. Ultimately, at the end of this point, we tell you that we get better aid, that the people are better off, and they're more willing to buy into this. Ultimately, this other point on and perception is better because we're able to show that the rules don't really care and that they care much more about getting the kids out of rubble. Because we can prove that we get better aid and that we get people more buying in, and that the US is competitive with China, that means that we win this debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite the leader of the affirmative team to give their reply.
Next best case, they can have two different worlds. The first world is a world where the Taiwanese buy in to the Chinese aid and become heavily economically and politically dependent on China. The second world is that the alternative is that the Taiwanese don't buy into the aid and try push the Chinese out, in which they're not even getting the benefits and the outcomes of the aid that they're trying to tell you. Firstly, on Taiwan's independence, secondly on aid, and thirdly on public buy-in. So I tell you that Taiwanese independence is the most important part of today's debate, because the fight for Taiwan's independence has been throughout decades, in which so many Taiwanese citizens and ancestors have been killed by Chinese military in the fight for their independence, right? This completely outweighs the aid they're able to get if, say in our worst case, they do get it faster, in which some people, most of these people have already died from the earthquake. We don't see how there's a significant amount of people you're saving in comparison to the fact that people's ancestors have been killed and they're literally losing some of this independence when they take that aid from China. Side Negating never sufficiently engaged with our material that we gave you down the line as to why we actually get this dependence, right? The only thing that they told us is that China won't go to war. Now, even if you believe that China won't go to war with China, which is untrue, we last saw that China employed, but even if they do want to, the fact that they haven't gone to war already is why they're able to go back in and use aid as a way to get that dependence, right? We think this material actually works on our side of the house. Then they we told you about like the fact that they will make political concessions to this. This material was also not responded to. We think this largely stands in the debate, and this is where our harms come. Even in our worst case, where you believe that they get quick aid, we think that the outcomes is that they just save like a couple more lives, and the fact that multiple ancestors and these are people's values in which they've been bought into the whole life, I think this largely outweighs the material on aid. But then secondly on aid, not all the materials contingent on Taiwanese people actually wanting to accept China's aid, a country that has historically fought and like abused their people. We think when they tell you that Chinese aid workers like are better because they have cultural similarities, firstly, I don't think Taiwanese people like Chinese culture too much when it's something that is like completely, they've literally separated away from this. But secondly, you simply do not need those similar cultures to provide aid. This looks like reconstructing the streets, reconstructing people's businesses. If you have communication problems, there are translators, there are interpreters, people from the US who provide aid also probably speak Taiwanese. We don't think how cultural dissimilarities are any big problem here. They also told us the main push was that China was close to Taiwan geographically. I think firstly, the difference in China flying over there or taking a ship over is maybe a couple hours, or just at the maximum 12 hours different to the US. The US also probably has operations in the area in which they can provide emergency relief. And secondly, China actually takes longer because they have other incentives that they have conceded to. The fact that they have band incentives, the fact that they have military incentives, which means it takes longer for these operations to actually take place when you involve the military. Thirdly, they tell us that China is large, they have money and manpower. I think this is just a really false claim, considering the US also has this. They don't get the US exclusively because we get the US exclusively for the fact that the US does not just want to work with the largest opposing superpower in a region that they are fighting over. This is completely illogical. Now, thirdly, onto public buy-in. Even if they get some benefit to faster aid and I think this is outweighed by the majority of the nation feeling oppressed and exploited by a huge country that has billions of people in comparison with they only have millions, that its life has been threatening to invade them from appearing to be more friendly. They tell us that China wants to look good to the rest of the countries, right? I think this claim literally contingents on the fact that countries want to like China. They already hate them. I don't think Taiwan is the thing that's making them hate them.
I thank the speaker for this speech, and now invite both teams to cross the floor and shake hands.
I think